All right, ceramic students, welcome back to the studio for day 3. Today we're going to talk a little bit more about the tools you made yesterday, and we have to make our slip. All right, so let's talk maybe easy stuff first. You're going to need your container for all of your bits and pieces of slip here. These, the things that we made yesterday, should be pretty dry now, dry enough that if you just kind of crumble them up, they should easily crush and become sort of small bits in your tray here. I find that if I'm going to make some slip, I have to make these bits of clay small enough that, it won't take all night for them to break down. But something like that would make some really great slip. Now what we need is some water. Just some water from the tap would be fine. I don't have a sink real close by, so I just filled up a jar. And we'll kind of pour that guy in. Now I just happen to have another spare jar here of slip, and this one happens to have a lid too. I think maybe I'll turn this into my slip. When you're adding your water, it'll almost start to break down immediately. Notice how I didn't fill it to the brim. I don't want my slip to be too watery, so I'm going to add less water at first. And maybe if my mic can pick that up, you can hear it already starting to break down. So that'll be perfect. I'm going to let that break down. We're not going to need it probably for a couple days, so it'll be perfect. It'll be ready to go in about 15-20 minutes. Now the other thing that I had you guys do yesterday was prepare some tools. Now I'll just show you again the tools that I had pre-made that came out of my art kit. They were some chisel tip tools, popsicle stick, and a coffee stirring stick. Here's the one that I made after our demonstration yesterday. So one end is a chisel tip tool. Let's get that zoomed in and focused a little bit. It's sort of flat and tapered on one end, and the other end is a little bit more like one of our fettling knife shapes or a scalpel shape. So you can see how I sanded down one edge of it and then I sharpened the edge of that guy. Now, because I was feeling a little bored yesterday and nothing like COVID sessions to make me want to get back into the studio, I picked up one of these scraps of wood that I had laying around the studio. That's just a split 2x4, and I made, using some sandpaper and a carving knife, a little bit more elegant carving tool. It has a little bit more of a rounded handle on one end, and it has that scalpel tip blade, something a little bit easier that I could cut with and work with. So if you've got access to a little bit of wood laying around the house and some extra tools, boy, it can be really nice to work with a tool that's a little bit larger in your hand than these smaller popsicle sticks. Here's a couple of things to consider, though, while you're maybe making your own tools. First thing is the type of wood you use is really, really important. If your wood has a big knot that runs through it, that's going to be really difficult to cut and to sand. So I would say try to avoid those things. You'll notice that these pieces of wood that I grabbed don't have any knots in them at all. Those knots make for incredibly difficult areas to sand. Essentially, that's where a branch would have been growing out of this piece of wood. Thin pallet wood usually works just fine. You'll notice that this piece is totally free of knots. That would be a great one. This wood that I grabbed here is pine. It's actually Douglas fir. It's the kind of stuff that we build houses out of for the most part. If you ended up grabbing a piece of wood that wasn't a soft pine, maybe something like oak or hickory, or this is actually a piece of pecan, you'll find that it's really, really hard. So the type of wood you grab is really important. The popsicle sticks that we're working with are pretty soft. You notice that they're pretty easy to sand and get those tips out, get those tips to shape up pretty quickly. The harder the wood, the slower that process is, and that little piece of sandpaper that I gave you probably wouldn't cut it. You'll end up wearing it out before you actually get that wood to soften up. A really great kind of wood to make tools out of is bamboo. It's an incredibly hard wood, and it's resistant to a lot of the water and moisture, but it'll wear out your sandpaper pretty quick. So maybe not the greatest one to use if you're just getting into that. Also, take a look at the direction of this grain. See how it flows down the length of the tool? It's really, really handy if you use long grain wood. This piece of pecan is a really nice piece of wood, but it's all short grain. It's a very, probably not the best piece of wood to be making tools out of if I'm going to be using it in the studio. You notice that the tool that I made, this sort of scalpel tool, has end grain in the butt of it, and the grain runs down the length of the tool. That's going to be a really handy type of wood to be able to work with. The other thing that I had access to in my studio was, beyond just the 120 grit sandpaper that we used in class, I used a couple different types of sandpaper. Something that has a little bit of a finer grit to it, some worn out 120, and I also used a couple of sanding blocks that have some foam backing on them. That can make sanding off some of the corners just a little bit easier and nicer on the hands. So now that you've got your slip good to go and your tools good to go, I'll be putting together another video to begin rolling out some slabs.